Have you ever wondered what would happen if a dedicated agricultural scientist found herself stranded in the middle of a raging storm, only to stumble upon a secretive barn laboratory hidden on a remote family farm? In this story, that exact twist of fate occurs, and the chain of events that follows will change more than just a few acres of land. Our main character sets out on a routine road trip, but when her car breaks down, she's drawn into a world of regenerative farming experiments and a daring showdown with a corporate giant. At stake is not only the future of a single homestead, but the fate of an entire farming community teetering on the brink. Want to know how it all ends? Stick with us to hear the full story. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales that spotlight real hope and transformation. The howling wind of a late summer storm swept across the Kansas prairie, stirring up dust and leaves along the empty highway as Margot Addison struggled to maintain control of her aging sedan. Rain hammered the windshield in turbulent bursts, and every so often, a crack of lightning illuminated the rolling fields stretching to the horizon. Margot, a 36-year-old agricultural scientist who looked every bit the stressed city dweller she was, had left Chicago that morning but chasing a slim lead on potential farmland for future testing. But a tangle of setbacks, funding shortfalls, departmental politics at her research institute, and her own sense of professional burnout had set her on this unexpected route. She was tired, both physically and emotionally, and just wanted to reach the next small town for a decent night's sleep. The wipers thumped urgently, trying in vain to clear a path through the darkness. Beneath the hood, her car engine began to sputter ominously, as though protesting its forced journey into the tempest. Margot gritted her teeth, easing off the accelerator and hoping the vehicle would hold out just a few more miles. The next service station, according to her outdated GPS, was supposed to be less than 15 minutes away. But as the engine coughed once more, a curl of black smoke escaped from under the hood. A sickening jolt ran through the steering column, and the sedan's headlights dimmed. Within seconds, the dashboard lit up like a warning beacon. Margot had no choice but to pull to the muddy shoulder of the deserted road, her hazard lights blinking feebly in the storm. She sat there for a moment, letting the reality sink in, stranded in the middle of Kansas, with no immediate help in sight, and her phone screen showing barely a bar of service. The rain's intensity had doubled, pounding on the car roof in deafening sheets. Every time lightning flashed, she caught glimpses of the endless fields outside. No houses, no lights, just an unrelenting sea of tall grass and the occasional silhouette of a tree. In that instant, she felt a profound sense of smallness, a reminder that nature and fate could conspire to humble even the most driven of individuals. Exhaling sharply, Margot pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, mustered her courage, and decided to brave the elements. Perhaps a farmhouse or barn stood nearby. She thought she had glimpsed a structure off to the right moments before the engine died. Popping the trunk, she retrieved a small flashlight and an old umbrella that threatened to buckle under the storm's fury. She stepped out into knee-high weeds and mud that sucked at her shoes, cursing quietly as the wind threatened to push her off balance. A few steps from the car, the beam of her flashlight caught sight of a faint sign mostly swallowed by the night Caldwell homestead. The paint on the sign was faded, the letters barely visible, but it was enough for Margot to cling to like a lifeline. Anywhere with a roof, at this point, would do. She trudged onward, rain lashing against her face, legs trembling with cold. She couldn't know it yet, but this unassuming sign marked the beginning of a journey that would unravel much of what she thought she knew about farming, research, and even herself. The path from the road to the homestead wasn't so much a driveway as it was a rutted trail, overgrown with grass and tangled weeds. Each step Margot took was accompanied by the squelch of wet soil clinging to her sneakers. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the rain pelted down harder, as though determined to test her resolve. She moved forward with her flashlight in short, cautious sweeps, trying to avoid ankle-twisting holes. Lightning flashed again, revealing the faint outlines of a barn off to one side. The structure looked aged but sturdy enough to serve as makeshift shelter until she could figure out what to do next. She reached the barn doors, which were tall and wooden, worn gray by decades of sun and wind. They gave a resistant creak as she pushed them open. But they weren't locked. Stepping inside, Margot found herself enveloped in darkness scented with hay, damp wood, and the lingering musk of livestock. She clicked her flashlight around the cavernous interior, half expecting to see farm equipment or maybe some old horses. Instead, she saw something completely unexpected, a series of stacked crates, labeled with scientific notations, and what looked like a rudimentary laboratory station set up on a heavy oak table. The battered desk lamp, a set of beakers, and some Petri dishes told her that this was no ordinary barn. Her curiosity piqued. Margot inched closer. A cold drip from the rafters landed on her shoulder, making her flinch. Just then, a flash of lightning filled the barn through the cracks in the boards, momentarily illuminating the entire space. She could make out rows of neat shelving filled with jars of soil samples, sealed containers, and an old bulletin board pinned with charts and hand-drawn field diagrams. It was almost surreal, like stepping into a secret annex of an agricultural research facility, except it was hidden within this seemingly forgotten barn. Before she had time to investigate further, a loud thump echoed from a loft area above. Margot froze. Her heart pounded against her ribcage, and her fist clenched around the flashlight, as though it might become a weapon if necessary. She stood absolutely still, listening for any follow-up sounds. For a moment, all she heard was the roaring storm outside and her own heartbeat thrumming in her ears. Another thump, followed by the sound of footsteps creaking on wooden planks, made her breath catch in her throat. Suddenly, a figure emerged at the top of the loft ladder, a tall, lean man wearing a faded flannel shirt. He paused, noticing her below, and raised his hands in a cautious, non-threatening gesture. "Hold on there, miss," he said, his voice deep but calm, cutting through the barn's gloom like a reassuring anchor. "You're soaking wet. Let's not scare each other. My name's Ethan Caldwell. This is my family's property. Are you all right?" Margot exhaled the breath she'd been holding, relieved that the man appeared more startled than menacing. I'm sorry," she stammered, pushing a strand of soaked hair off her forehead. "My car. It died out on the main road. The sign said Caldwell Homestead, and I was just looking for shelter from the storm." Ethan nodded slowly, eyeing her drenched coat and the trembling flashlight beam in her hand. "Well, you found it," he said simply. "Storm like this, you don't want to be out there. We can figure out your car situation in the morning." He gestured for her to follow him down a short corridor of stalls. Despite the flickering overhead bulb and the persistent thunder outside, Margot felt an odd sense of reassurance welling up inside her, as though fate or serendipity had delivered her here. Ethan guided Margot toward a side room in the barn, which seemed half workshop and half storage area. He flicked a switch, and a solitary overhead light buzzed awake, illuminating an old wooden table, shelves full of tools, and something that looked very much like a makeshift incubator for plant experiments. The corners of the floor were cluttered with empty seed bags, scattering the floor like leftover confetti from a bygone era. Margot felt a wave of exhaustion overtake her. The adrenaline rush from walking through the storm had subsided, leaving her shivering and keenly aware of her soaked clothes. She glanced around for a place to sit, finally perching on an old wooden stool near a small space heater. Ethan opened a metal cabinet and pulled out a couple of towels, offering them with a polite nod. As she dried off, Margot caught her reflection in a dusty window pane, dark circles under her eyes, cheeks flushed from the cold, hair clinging in damp coils around her face. She looked as though she'd stepped out of a war zone. "Thank you," she said, her voice raspy from the chill. "I'm Margot Addison. By the way," he responded with a brief smile. "Good to meet you, Margot. You're lucky you saw that old sign. I took it down from the main road last month because it was so faded. Guess I forgot there was a smaller one nailed out front." Margot, warming her hands near the space heater, nodded toward the strange setup in the barn's main area. "That doesn't look like typical farm stuff. Did you study agriculture or something?" Ethan hesitated, then gave a half shrug. "Sort of. I did some coursework in agronomy years back. Got interested in alternative approaches." After my father's health started failing, I left Cornell where I was teaching to come back and manage the farm. My father passed on, and, well, I stayed, trying to figure out how to keep this place alive. His tone was guarded, but Margot could sense an undercurrent of loss and determination behind it. Well, I'm an agricultural scientist, she offered, hoping to find common ground. I've been working on drought-resistant crops at the Franklin Research Institute in Chicago. Or, I guess I was until recently. Her face clouded momentarily as she recalled the bureaucratic battles, the overshadowing corporate funding, and her own disenchantment that had eventually led her to consider an extended leave of absence. Ethan didn't pry. Instead, he nodded in thoughtful silence. Outside, a low roll of thunder indicated the storm's continued presence, but it seemed to be mellowing. An occasional flash still lit the clouds, but the deafening roar of wind and rain had lessened to a persistent hiss. "I can set you up a cot in here," he said, gesturing to a corner of the room. "Ain't the Ritz, but it'll keep you dry. In the morning, I can drive you to the next town. See if we can get your car tow-osed." Grateful, Margot accepted. Exhaustion hit her like a wave, and soon she was lying on a thin mattress topped with an extra blanket. The storm's lullaby drummed on the barn's tin roof, but as she closed her eyes, she couldn't help wondering what this odd meeting might signify. Two agricultural researchers, each disillusioned by mainstream methods, crossing paths by pure coincidence in the middle of a Kansas tempest. By the time dawn arrived, the rain had reduced to a drizzle, and a gentle mist hovered over the fields. Margot awoke stiff and cold, but otherwise safe and uninjured, the night's adrenaline having ebbed away. She peeked out through a gap in the barn siding, eyes landing on endless stretches of farmland glistening under the pearly morning light. Rows of waist-high plants swayed gently, leaves dripping with leftover rain. Beyond them stood a modest farmhouse, its paint peeling around the edges, front porch steps sagging with age. Yet, like the barn, it seemed solid enough, a monument to resilience in this remote landscape. She found Ethan already awake, sipping coffee from a tin mug and tinkering with some sort of solar-powered battery rig that looked homemade. "Morning," he said as she approached, handing her a spare mug. "It's black coffee. Hope that's okay." Margot took a grateful gulp. The warmth spread through her chest, and she exhaled, feeling some of the tension in her body slip away. "Thanks," she said, looking around. "So, this is all yours, huh? The Caldwell homestead?" Ethan nodded, though his expression held a mixture of pride and burden. "It's been in my family for 5 generations. My grandfather used to say this land could grow anything if you listened to it. I started listening more closely after I came back." Margot recalled the makeshift lab in the barn. "You're doing soil experiments out here, aren't you?" she asked. Curiosity piqued. "I saw the jars, the charts." He took another sip of coffee. "I guess you could say that. My father, he got sick, and the fields were in rough shape. Decades of conventional practices had drained the land, chemicals, shallow tilling, the usual. We had a couple of terrible harvests. Eventually, I decided to try something radical: regenerative methods, minimal till, soil biology emphasis. Everyone thought I was crazy, but it was that or lose the farm entirely. So I turned the barn into a lab of sorts, began tracking data on soil composition, fungal networks, water infiltration. Slow progress, but it's working." Margot listened, enthralled. Back in Chicago, her lab specialized in genetically modifying crops to tolerate drought, focusing on gene editing and synthetic fertilizers to boost yields. She'd rarely given serious thought to the possibility that the soil ecosystem itself could be the missing link. "That's quite something," she said finally, glancing toward the emerald rose that shimmered in the morning light. "So these fields, they're your test subjects?" Ethan nodded with a wry smile. "Yes, and if I'm wrong, I lose everything. But if I'm right, maybe we can prove that real sustainability doesn't have to come from a chemical jug or a patented gene sequence. It might just come from paying attention to what the earth is telling us." Margot took in the scene, feeling an unexpected wave of admiration. She realized Ethan had risked far more than she ever had. Her battles were mostly grant proposals and departmental squabbles. His were about heritage, the memories of his family, and the very soil beneath his feet. The sense of determination in him was palpable, and despite the gravity of his words, the morning air felt unexpectedly optimistic. She set her coffee cup down and followed him out of the barn, both of them stepping into the drizzle, ready to see the fields up close. The short walk from the barn to the first row of crops felt like a portal from Margot's structured laboratory world into a realm where nature was both collaborator and teacher. Droplets of water weighed down the leaves, causing them to brush softly against her ankles. "This is winter wheat," Ethan explained, kneeling down to examine a green shoot pushing through the soil. "But it's also part of a rotation plan. In a couple months, I'll overseed with clover to fix nitrogen. Later, sunflowers might come up in scattered patterns to break pest cycles." Margot bent down, too, taking a handful of the soil and crumbling it between her fingers. It felt richer than she expected, not the compact, almost lifeless dirt she'd seen on many conventional farms. She noticed small, fibrous roots weaving through it, and the faint smell was that of fresh earth, reminiscent of forests. "Back in Chicago, we used greenhouse chambers and artificial lighting to test seeds," she murmured. "We measure viability, yields, drought thresholds. But here, you're using nature itself as your lab." He glanced up. "Nature doesn't lie. Sometimes it just takes patience. And data. Of course, I'm not against science. I track everything: moisture retention, nutrient content, pH levels. But I let the plants, the insects, even the weeds, tell me the story." Curious, Margot asked how he irrigated. "I don't," he replied, standing up and gesturing across the fields. "Or at least, only minimally. That's why I focus so much on soil structure and organic matter. If the soil can hold water from the rainfall, I don't need to pump the aquifer dry. I still have a backup well, but I see that as a last resort." As they walked, the sky began to brighten, revealing more of the homestead: a modest orchard of dwarf fruit trees, a patch of vegetables grown in a spiral design, and beyond that, another set of fields with thicker, taller plants that Margot couldn't immediately identify. She saw some contraptions that looked like do-it-yourself wind turbines, placed strategically to harness the never-ending prairie gusts. Despite the farmhouse's shabby exterior, the farm's layout and the equipment scattered around it hinted at a blend of old-fashioned practicality and modern ingenuity. Suddenly, a battered pickup truck rumbled up the dirt path toward them. The driver, a middle-aged woman wearing a wide-brimmed hat, waved enthusiastically. She hopped out and introduced herself as Lillian Tate, a neighbor who ran a smaller farm down the road. "I heard the storm might have stranded you folks," she said, nodding to Margot. "Figured I'd come by. Make sure everything's all right." Ethan gave a friendly grin. "We're fine, car trouble. Though, maybe you could give Margot a lift into town later." Lillian looked at Margot with warm curiosity. "Sure thing. But Ethan, don't forget we have that field demonstration next week. A few other farmers want to see your methods. I told them I'd bring them by." She turned to Margot. "He's too modest to tell you, but people around here respect what he's doing. We've had some bad drought years, and the old chemical ways aren't cutting it anymore." Margot sensed the undercurrent of urgency behind Lillian's words. Drought, rising costs, a system on the brink. Perhaps Ethan's quiet revolution on the Caldwell homestead was not just a personal experiment. It could be a lifeline for an entire community, and, if proven scalable, a model for struggling farmers far beyond Kansas. Margot's plan had been to make a quick trip into the nearest town, call a tow service, and figure out the next steps for her stranded car. But as she rode with Lillian in the pickup, passing miles of farmland, she couldn't shake the pull of the Caldwell homestead and Ethan's work. Something about the sincerity of his methods and the potential importance of them awakened a spark in her, a curiosity she hadn't felt in years. They reached a dusty little roadside garage that doubled as a tow service. The mechanic, an elderly man wearing a grease-stained cap, shook his head at the sedan's condition. "Blown gasket. Maybe more," he pronounced somberly. I'll do my best. But parts might take 3 or 4 days. With that settled, Margot booked a room at the only motel in a 30-mile radius, a small place called Prairie View Lodge that overlooked what might have once been a bustling train depot. She tried to settle in, tossed her duffel bag onto the bed, freshened up, but found herself restless, replaying the conversation with Ethan over and over in her mind. She recalled the aroma of the soil, the sheets of data scrawled in his barn lab, and how quickly her usual skepticism had melted into fascination. Later that evening, she discovered a tiny diner off the main street. Its neon sign buzzed overhead, flickering in the dim twilight. Inside, she ate a simple meal of country fried steak and mashed potatoes that tasted better than any fancy restaurant she'd been to in Chicago. Halfway through her meal, she overheard a couple of farmers in the next booth talking about Caldwell's new test field and the surprising resilience it showed despite the meager rainfall. "If that boy can keep going like this," one of them said, "maybe we won't have to sell off." Margot couldn't resist the urge to listen. She pretended to be engrossed in a local newspaper, but every word about Ethan's soil biology approach made her ears perk up. It seemed that in a region battered by drought and low commodity prices, folks were starting to pay attention to anything that could offer a lifeline. And there was a note of hope in their voices, perhaps reluctant, but hope nonetheless. After dinner, she returned to her motel room feeling a mix of excitement and uncertainty. She should be heading back to Chicago soon to address her professional limbo at the Franklin Research Institute. She'd practically walked out on the biggest project of her career after a series of disputes over funding and corporate partnerships. Yet here she was, enthralled by a small farm in Kansas and a man who had given up a university career to save his family's land. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, listening to distant crickets and the soft hum of a single street lamp outside. Thoughts swirled in her mind. Ideas about how her research might intersect with Ethan's. How integrating a deeper focus on soil ecology could enhance genetic modifications, or perhaps even make them less necessary. She realized the synergy might be powerful, but she also recognized the massive obstacles big agribusiness, entrenched research institutions, and the skepticism of farmers who had been burned by new solutions before. Nonetheless, the seed of an idea had been planted, and Margot knew she had to see it through, at least for a few more days. The next morning, she returned to the Caldwell homestead in Lillian's truck. The storm clouds had disappeared, replaced by a crisp blue sky. A soft breeze rustled the grasses, and in the air felt clean and refreshed. Ethan greeted them in front of the barn, looking the same as he had the previous day, slightly disheveled hair, old jeans, and boots that had clearly seen better days. Yet there was a composed energy about him, a sense of being exactly where he was meant to be. Margot got right to the point. "I've got a few days until my car is fixed," she said, folding her arms. "I'd like to spend some time here, see more of what you're doing, maybe take some notes for my own research. Is that all right with you?" Ethan studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, I have nothing to hide. In fact, I could use a second set of eyes. Today, I'm sampling some soils from the new test plots on the southeast corner. Want to tag along within the hour?" They were crouching in a field that had once been parched by years of over-farming. Ethan explained that he had planted an experimental blend of winter rye, native grasses, and a few nitrogen-fixing legumes. While conventional wisdom said to keep the fields as uniform as possible, Ethan had intentionally cultivated diversity. "Diversity is resilience," he'd said. "If one thing fails, another will take its place, and the soil structure remains intact." Margot watched as he carefully inserted a sampling tool into the earth, extracting a core of soil that displayed distinct layers. Each layer told a story: dark topsoil, riddled with fine roots, gradually shifting to lighter, compacted subsoil deeper down. She took out a small test kit from her own bag, wanting to measure the nitrate levels and compare. They worked in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging notes or measurements, forming a makeshift partnership driven by curiosity and mutual respect for the land. As noon approached, they headed back to the barn where Ethan had set up a rudimentary lab station, Petri dishes and old microscopes stood next to neatly labeled jars of sample soil. While he arranged his new samples, Margot noticed an entire wall of pinned research articles and diagrams. Some were typed, others hand-sketched. A few had been clipped from academic journals she recognized, but there were also personal photographs. Ethan, much younger, wearing a graduation gown, smiling proudly beside an older man, presumably his father. Another photo showed Ethan with a faculty group at Cornell. The progression of images told a story of a man who had once been on an academic fast track, but then chose a very different path. Seeing her linger at the photos, Ethan offered a small smile. Dad always told me that real knowledge comes from getting your hands dirty. I thought I could learn everything in a lecture hall. But by the time he got sick, I realized I needed to be here in person if I was going to save this place. Margot nodded, caught between admiration and a pang of her own regret. She, too, had spent years in labs, chasing data and grants, often feeling disconnected from the very farmers who were supposed to benefit from her breakthroughs. Standing here amid the earthy smells and tangible evidence of transformation, she began to wonder if she'd been missing the most crucial piece of the puzzle all along. Over the following days, Margot witnessed the intricate tapestry of Ethan's operation in a way she had never seen before on any farm, conventional or otherwise. One morning, they drove out to a field rimmed by a small windbreak of poplar trees. The land in question looked almost wild at first glance, with various cover crops interspersed among neat rows of corn. Yet, upon closer inspection, the layout revealed a deliberate pattern, a rotation designed to ensure every segment of soil was either growing something beneficial or lying temporarily fallow to recuperate. Amid the rows, they found beneficial insect traps and small wooden boxes that housed pollinators. Margot marveled at how meticulously Ethan monitored everything. He had spreadsheets for soil moisture, daily logs of weather conditions, and even a time-lapse camera set up to track plant growth and phases. This method was rigorous enough to rival any academic research program, yet it felt far more grounded in real day-to-day farming practice. She tried to share some of her own insights. From her work with drought-resistant crop genomes, Margot understood how critical certain gene expressions were for root development under water stress. She pointed out that some of these natural companion crops had genes related to root structure that might help the soil hold moisture. Ethan, in turn, explained how chemical pesticides often disrupted the very microbial communities that made plants more resilient. The synergy was startling, like two halves of a conversation that had been missing each other. In the evenings, they discussed broader issues: how corporate funding steered much of the agricultural research in the country, how farmers were often caught in a cycle of debt buying fertilizers and pesticides, and how a change in climate patterns was only intensifying the stakes. Ethan confided that local farmers were on the brink of giving up, especially those who had borrowed heavily in hopes of better yields. Margot remembered overhearing the farmers at the diner, how they spoke of a quiet desperation. One afternoon, as they were cleaning equipment in the barn, a knock sounded at the large doors. Ethan slid them open to reveal a woman in her early 60s, tall, with silver-streaked hair tied back in a neat ponytail. He introduced her as Lillian Tate's friend, Willow Morgan, who was known for her own experiments with heritage seeds. Willow had heard that Margot was collecting data and wanted to share her grandfather's strain of drought-tolerant sorghum. "It hasn't had any real scientific analysis," Willow said, holding out a small burlap pouch. "But he used to say it grew strong in the worst summers." Margot was taken aback by the generosity. Willow was entrusting her with something likely precious to her family, all in the hope it might help other farmers. This spirit of collective resilience was a stark contrast to the competitive research environment Margot knew too well back in Chicago. She promised to conduct some basic tests, and Willow smiled with relief. "My land's just a bit up the road," she explained. "You need more seeds. You let me know. The last thing we want is for these old varieties to vanish." By the time dusk settled in, Margot realized that she was no longer an outside observer. She was becoming part of this informal network, an alliance of local farmers, each doing what they could to survive a changing world. And for the first time in years, she felt a renewed sense of purpose that transcended professional ambition. When the tow mechanic called to say Margot's car repair was nearly done, she found herself hesitating. Part of her felt the tug of unfinished business back in Chicago, her job, her reputation, maybe even the chance to rejoin a major research project. But another part worried that if she left now, she might never fully grasp the transformative potential unfolding here in these Kansas fields. On a whim, she decided to drive out to Lillian Tate's farm. Lillian, who had welcomed her with open arms, was widely respected in the area, and Margot wanted to understand the broader community context. Maybe it would help her make an informed decision about how to move forward. Lillian's place was smaller than Ethan's, with just a few barns and a house built in the old Victorian style, but it, too, radiated a sense of history and resilience. Lillian showed Margot her fields, where she grew a rotation of soybeans, wheat, and alfalfa using methods she'd partially adopted from Ethan's experiments. She explained that after years of dwindling yields, switching to more regenerative practices had given her new hope. "We're not all the way there yet," Lillian admitted, "but my topsoil's improving, and I'm using less fertilizer every season." The conversation naturally drifted to the upcoming field demonstration. Lillian confided that a half-dozen farmers from the surrounding counties planned to show up, anxious to see real-world results of Ethan's methods. The stakes were high if the demonstration convinced them. They might take the leap and attempt similar transitions. But if they were unconvinced, the region might default to old practices or worse, sell off farmland to big agribusinesses. "I've seen families lose their land after a couple years of bad drought," Lillian said, her gaze distant. "When that happens, it's not just about losing a job, it's a way of life, a heritage. You can't put a price on that. So if Ethan's system, with Margot Addison's scientific insight, can give us some security, I'm all for it." She smiled then, the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes deepening. "I heard you two make a good team." Margot felt her cheeks warm slightly. She opened her mouth to protest that it wasn't like that, but realized she had no real objection. "We do bounce ideas off each other pretty well," she admitted, glancing at her notes. "And I'm learning more here in 1 week than I sometimes learned in months of lab work. It's refreshing." Heading back to her motel later, Margot replayed that conversation in her mind. The demonstration was only a few days away, and she could sense the community's anticipation. Farmers who were once skeptical of Ethan's compost tea or cover crop cocktails were now curious to witness tangible proof. Everything the hopes of struggling families. The future of farming in this drought-stricken region seemed to hang in a delicate balance. A thought occurred to her, perhaps the synergy between her own research and Ethan's regenerative methods could be exactly what these farmers needed, especially if it could be presented in a compelling, data-driven way. And maybe she could find her own path out of the institutional dead ends, forging a bridge between academic rigor and the lived realities of people on the land. The day of the field demonstration dawned with a gentle breeze and a cloudless sky that promised scorching heat by noon. Farmers arrived in trucks and tractors, some carpooling from neighboring counties. A few staff from the local agricultural extension service showed up as well, clipboards in hand. Margot noticed a palpable mix of skepticism, curiosity, and guarded optimism on their faces. Ethan had set up a series of stations across several plots. One station highlighted soil comparisons, with samples from both his regenerative fields and a control plot managed conventionally. Another displayed the variety of cover crops he'd employed, accompanied by signage explaining how each plant functioned. Some fixed nitrogen, others drew deep minerals closer to the surface, and many helped prevent erosion. Yet another station showcased water infiltration, where a simple rainfall simulator revealed how well Ethan's fields retained water compared to fields that were tilled and left bare. Margot played a supporting role, eagerly helping farmers examine data readouts and collecting real-time measurements with a portable sensor kit. The hands-on approach enthralled those in attendance. No one was forced to read through endless academic papers or press releases. Instead, they could see it themselves, the soil that clumped together like a sponge and didn't break apart under the rainfall simulator, the healthy root systems that reached astonishing depths. Lillian Tate stood by, lending her voice of experience. "I've started using some of these cover crop blends, and my fields are looking better than they have in years," she told a small crowd. "I'm not going to pretend it's easy or cheap up front, but I've cut my fertilizer bill, and I'm not draining my well nearly as much. Willow Morgan displayed her heritage sorghum, explaining its family lineage and how it had survived droughts in past generations. For many of the older farmers, this detail resonated strongly. They recalled their parents or grandparents growing such crops before synthetic chemicals became widespread. The memory of how farmland was once treated like a living, breathing entity stirred a sense of nostalgia and hope. Margot could feel the momentum building. By mid-morning, the demonstration felt like an impromptu community gathering. People discussed finances, how they might afford the transition, and shared personal anecdotes about dealing with drought. Occasionally, children darted between the rows, chasing each other in the hot sun, a reminder that the future of farming was tied to these next generations as well. Yet, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some older farmers remained skeptical. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "Looks good in theory," one man muttered, "but I've got a bank to answer to. If I don't produce enough the next season, I'm done." Ethan acknowledged these concerns openly, explaining how incremental changes could mitigate risk. Margot chimed in, offering data on cost savings over a 3-year window. In her city lab, she had never felt the sense of urgency that came from a farmer's immediate financial predicament. Now she understood that science alone wouldn't solve the crisis unless it addressed the real-life economics and day-to-day struggles. When lunchtime came, everyone gathered for a potluck under the shade of a few large cottonwood trees. The conversation continued, but it felt lighter, more hopeful. Margot realized that what she was witnessing was more than a demonstration of farming techniques. It was the dawning of a shared vision. That afternoon, after the crowd trickled away and the last pickup rumbled down the dirt road, Margot and Ethan found themselves finally alone in the barn. They collapsed onto a pair of overturned crates, sweaty and exhausted, but undeniably energized by the day's events. Even the barn's usual hush felt charged with possibility. "So," Margot said, wiping her forehead with a bandana, "I think that went better than I could have imagined. People seem genuinely open to this." Ethan nodded, still catching his breath. "I hoped it would help. I just didn't expect so many to show up. It felt more like a county fair than a field demo. But if it makes a difference in even a handful of operations, it could ripple outward." As they spoke, Margot realized they were standing at a crossroads. She had enough data points from infiltration rates to biomass yields to craft a compelling study that might convince even the most jaded institution. Coupled with her background in genetic improvements, the synergy could become a pioneering, system-wide approach, soil-based regenerative methods supplemented by carefully selected traits for drought tolerance. If done right, it could help farmers everywhere break free from reliance on expensive chemical inputs and pivot to a more sustainable model. Her thoughts drifted to the Franklin Research Institute in Chicago, which had poured millions into gene editing projects. The tension between that approach and what she just witnessed nagged at her. Big agricultural corporations often pushed for patentable seeds, guaranteeing recurrent profit, while ignoring the holistic health of the land. Yet, the data here didn't lie with minimal irrigation and no chemical fertilizers. These fields were thriving in conditions that left neighboring farms struggling. "I'm thinking about starting something," she said softly. "A network, maybe a collaborative platform that connects farmers who want to try this approach with researchers who can gather data and refine techniques. We'd need to figure out funding, maybe find some philanthropic backers. But it might be the best way to scale up what you're doing without letting corporations lock it all behind paywalls and patents." Ethan listened, his brow furrowing slightly. "So you'd work with your old connections for funding? The same folks who wanted to push quick fixes?" Margot shook her head. "Not exactly. I have some leads on independent foundations that support sustainable agriculture. They might be open to an approach that combines real-world practicality with scientific rigor. But it won't be easy. There's a lot of entrenched money in conventional agribusiness." He studied her, as though weighing trust. "If we do this, we do it in a way that protects the farmers. I don't want them exploited or forced into another cycle of debt just to chase new methods. The reason this works is because it's locally adapted, flexible, and not reliant on one-size-fits-all solutions. Margot nodded earnestly. She found herself unexpectedly moved by his concern for the community. It echoed her own long-suppressed desire to see research genuinely serve people rather than profit margins. Agreed. And we have to keep the data open source, so farmers can learn freely. If you're on board, I'm on board. In that moment, it felt as though they would forged an unspoken pact. Outside, the light was beginning to fade, painting the Kansas sky in fiery reds and oranges. Margot pulled out her notepad and began jotting down potential next steps, contacts to call, grants to apply for, ways to structure a pilot network. She and Ethan sat side by side in the heart of that worn barn, fueled by a rare blend of urgency and hope. Word spread rapidly within days. Farmers from neighboring counties reached out to Ethan, expressing interest in what he and Margot were proposing. Some were cautious, wanting more data, while others were desperate for any alternative to their failing yields and deepening debts. Lillian Tate became an unofficial liaison, hosting small gatherings at her place where farmers could swap stories, ask questions, and sign up to learn more. Margot, meanwhile, spent her evenings in the motel room, typing up proposals and emailing philanthropic foundations or environmental grant makers, explaining the unique potential of integrating ground-level regenerative methods with advanced plant genetics in an open-source framework. She titled the concept Project Heartland Resilience, a name that captured both its geographic focus and its underlying philosophy. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from Chicago, where her absence had not gone unnoticed. The Franklin Research Institute was in a frenzy, not only because she'd left mid-project, but also because rumors circulated that she was championing a competing method. Some colleagues sent wary or even dismissive notes, warning her that the big funding bodies would never support such a radical shift. But a handful reached out privately, expressing admiration. "We've known for years that soil health is the missing piece," wrote one researcher. "We just never had the leverage to push it." The more pushback Margot received, the more certain she felt that she was onto something critical. She poured herself into the day-to-day farm work at Caldwell Homestead, even as she juggled late-night calls with prospective funders. Each morning, she joined Ethan for field checks, measuring growth rates and collecting soil cores. In the afternoons, she updated spreadsheets and wrote briefs, mindful of how urgent the climate-driven crises were becoming. One particularly promising lead came from a small family foundation that valued community empowerment. They were intrigued by the idea that local farmers could be co-researchers, not just passive recipients of top-down directives. The foundation insisted on transparency, farmer-led decision-making, and shared ownership of intellectual property, exactly what Ethan and Margot had envisioned. The weeks flew by in a blur, and soon the long, hot days of August settled over Kansas. For many farmers in the region, it was a pivotal time, as the effects of drought intensified. But on the Caldwell fields, the vegetation remained remarkably robust. Photos of Ethan's lush greenery spreading through social media platforms spurred more inquiries. Journalists began sniffing around, wanting to feature the professor-turned-farmer who seemed to be doing the impossible. Margot caught a glimpse of the new reality when she received a call from a national news outlet. They wanted an on-camera interview, hoping to capture the story of this homestead-turned-modern agriculture lab. She was torn. While publicity could attract more funding and wider acceptance, it also invited scrutiny and potential commercialization. She discussed it with Ethan, who shrugged. "If it helps more folks adapt, I'm willing," he said. "But I won't pretend we have all the answers yet. We're still learning." Little did they know, not everyone viewed their project with enthusiasm. Whispers emerged of agricultural corporations eyeing the intellectual property potential. Some local farm suppliers grumbled that the Caldwell methods might reduce the sale of chemical inputs, undercutting their business. Tensions were brewing. But for now, the sense of possibility outweighed the fear, and Project Heartland Resilience pressed forward, fueled by the simple idea that the best answers might come from the ground up. The turning point arrived unexpectedly in the form of a legal notice. On a Monday morning, Margot's phone buzzed incessantly with messages marked urgent. When she finally picked up, she heard the strained voice of her former supervisor at the Franklin Research Institute. According to him, a major agribusiness consortium led by Titan AgriCorp had taken an interest in her research, specifically in any synergy between her genetic modifications and the regenerative protocols she'd been developing. Margot's heart sank as she scrolled through a forwarded email containing dense legal jargon references to intellectual property, joint ownership clauses, and demands for immediate disclosure of all data. Essentially, Titan AgriCorp was claiming that Margot's time at the Institute, coupled with her ongoing research, meant they had partial rights to anything she produced even though she wasn't using their funding and was no longer officially employed there. She stared at the screen in disbelief, then marched straight to the barn to find Ethan. He was in the midst of cataloging recent soil test results, a half-eaten sandwich next to his laptop. She thrust the phone toward him, her voice trembling slightly with frustration. "They want our data, Ethan. They're saying it belongs to them because I used to be under a contract that says anything I develop, they can claim a stake in." Ethan's face hardened. "That's ridiculous. This isn't some gene-edited seed you designed in a corporate lab. This is knowledge we glean from working with living soil, from trial and error on my family's land." They spent the next few hours on calls with lawyers, feeling the pressure intensify. While a handful of philanthropic foundations had expressed interest, none of them wanted to wade into a legal quagmire. Corporate lawyers, well-funded and relentless, could stall or intimidate the smaller initiatives to the brink of bankruptcy. Word of the notice spread among local farmers, inciting a mix of anger and worry. Lillian Tate organized a quick meeting, where the group decided to stand united in refusing to hand over any data that was collected cooperatively. "This knowledge belongs to the people who put their sweat into it," Lillian declared. "If Titan or the Franklin Institute want in, they need to respect our terms, not try to bulldoze us with legal threats." Tensions rose even higher when a representative from Titan AgriCorp unexpectedly arrived in town. Speaking with local bankers and extension agents, rumors flew that they intended to buy up distressed farmland, effectively controlling both the property and any new methods discovered on it. People feared that if Titan gained enough influence, they could rewrite the rules of farming in this region to suit their profit motives. But the adversity seemed to galvanize Ethan, Margot, and the other farmers. Instead of backing down, they doubled their efforts to formalize Project Heartland Resilience as a cooperative, with binding agreements that protected data as open-source intellectual property. Margot drafted a set of foundational principles no single entity would ever hold exclusive rights. Any profits from seeds or technology developed through the project would funnel back into the cooperative to help struggling farmers. "Let's see them try to sue an entire network of hundreds of farmers," Ethan said grimly. The challenge was enormous, but for many in this tight-knit community, it was a fight worth taking. The very soil they stood on was their inheritance, their home, and their legacy. No legal contract could override that sacred bond. Autumn arrived, painting in the Kansas fields in amber and gold. Despite the legal wrangling, Project Heartland Resilience continued to expand. Farmers from multiple states now expressed interest in adopting regenerative practices that integrated Margot's seed insights with Ethan's soil management. For each new member who joined, a local mentor would be assigned someone who had already spent months working under the new system, ready to guide them through the initial transition. Margot and Ethan established a simple but effective online platform where farmers could upload daily observations, weather impacts, and yield data. In return, they received access to real-time soil analyses, possible genetic pairings for their climate, and a supportive community that shared tips, setbacks, and small victories. The entire system operated under a Creative Commons-like license, designed to prevent any corporate takeover. Support trickled in from unexpected places. A few major newspapers ran features on the Kansas cooperative defying Big Ag. Some philanthropic organizations, impressed by the grassroots nature of the work, offered modest grants. A group of retired agronomists volunteered to help interpret data. Even some extension agents from outside the region wrote to inquire how they could replicate the model. Still, Titan AgriCorp's looming shadow never fully disappeared. Their legal team sent periodic threats, each more creatively worded than the last, but so far hadn't found a single solid ground to claim exclusive ownership. It helped that Ethan could document his years of experimentation before Margot's arrival, proving that much of the knowledge existed prior to any research she'd done under corporate-backed grants. One chilly evening, a group of farmers gathered at Caldwell Homestead for a harvest celebration, a nod to the older traditions that once bound rural communities together. There were potluck tables laden with homemade casseroles and peas. Willow Morgan brought her heritage sorghum, flour bread, and Lillian Tate contributed fresh dairy products from her own small herd. Soft music played from a battered old radio, and children ran through the orchard laughing. Amid the crowd, Margot found a quiet moment to slip away and gaze out over the fields. She thought about how drastically her life had changed in a matter of months. No more sterile lab benches and corporate deadlines. Instead, she stood on ground that was renewing itself, part of a collective endeavor where success was measured not just in yield per acre, but in the health of the soil, the stability of rural livelihoods, and the intangible sense of hope that had returned. She sensed someone approaching and turned to see Ethan. He handed her a mug of spiced cider, steam curling into the crisp air. "You all right?" he asked softly. She smiled, nodding. "Better than all right. I feel like I finally understand what it means to serve a cause bigger than my own ambitions." He gave her a quiet, knowing grin. "That's how I felt when I walked away from Cornell. Hard at first, but worth every second now." For a moment, they stood there, gazing at the silhouettes of new cover crops, sprouting under the twilight. A gentle wind passed through, rustling the orchard leaves. The image was both humble and profound, a testament to the human capacity for change when guided by respect for the land and each other. Late that night, after the celebration waned and the guests departed, Margot found herself alone on the farmhouse porch. Lantern light spilled onto the wooden planks, revealing the dog-eared journal she held in her lap. The journal was a record of everything she had learned over the past several months: daily field notes, sketches of soil strata, transcripts of interviews with local elders, and even personal reflections on her own evolution from a purely lab-based researcher to a hands-in-the-dirt collaborator. Flipping through the pages, she paused at the earliest entries, made right after her car had broken down on that stormy Kansas road. Back then, she'd been lost emotionally as much as physically. But now, the words on the page chronicled a journey of discovery and growth. Each new note read like a revelation: soil infiltration up 30%. Heritage seeds show viability under extreme heat. Farmer-led data is more robust than anticipated. And then there were the intangible observations, like how working side by side with Ethan and the other farmers had rekindled her belief in the power of community. The porch creaked lightly as Ethan stepped out, carrying a small tray with 2 mugs of herbal tea. He set the tray down, and they sipped in a comfortable silence for a moment, gazing at the blanket of stars overhead. The moonlight illuminated the fields, revealing silhouettes of cover crops dancing in the late-season breeze. Crickets provided the night's soundtrack, a steady chorus of life continuing just below the surface of human awareness. Margot closed the journal and looked at Ethan. "I've been thinking a lot about the next steps," she said, her tone serious but hopeful. "We have the pilot network running. We've proven that both small and medium-sized farms can adopt these methods if we give them the right support. If we want to extend this nationwide or even globally, we'll need more resources, more formal structure." Ethan nodded, sipping his tea. "I know. And I also know that as soon as we scale up, the big players are going to push back harder. They can't afford to let an entire generation of farmers realize they don't need all those costly inputs." Margot leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "We can't hide forever, but maybe we can create alliances with like-minded organizations, sustainability groups, small regional banks, co-ops, university extension programs that still prioritize local communities. There's a lot of disillusioned people out there who want real change." He reached out and briefly covered her hand with his, a gesture of solidarity. "I'm in," he said, simply. The night air felt electric, charged by the possibility of a future they would shape rather than one shaped for them by corporate dictates. A gentle breeze shifted the wind chimes overhead, producing a soft, melodic tinkle. The sounds of the farmland at night rustling leaves, distant lowing of cattle, the faint chirp of insects coalesced into a harmonious background. Two silhouettes on a porch, forging a plan to nurture not just crops, but a new way of thinking. And so, as the final hours of night wore on, Margot Addison and Ethan Caldwell laid the groundwork for the next phase of Project Heartland Resilience. Their story had begun with a broken car on a rainy evening, but it had grown into something far more enduring. With the rising sun, they would continue this work in earnest, bridging the gap between soil and seed, farmer and scientist, tradition and innovation, proving that even in the face of drought, debt, and corporate pressure, life can flourish when people dare to dream of a better harvest for everyone. Looking back, it's amazing how a small misfortune, one broken car in a thunderstorm, could trigger such a powerful wave of change. From a weary scientist on the verge of giving up, our main character transforms into a champion for regenerative farming, helping an embattled community reclaim its pride and prosperity. Meanwhile, the local farmers learn that the soil beneath their feet can be both a teacher and a treasure, guiding them to more resilient ways of living. This story shows us that hope often lies in unexpected places, and that real progress takes courage, collaboration, and a belief in something bigger than ourselves. If you found these themes inspiring, please leave your comments or questions below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay connected with us for more uplifting stories just like this one.